Chapter 1: The Alchemical Wagon. The rain turned the circus grounds into a churning sea of mud. It clung to Cora's boots with the grip of a drowning man, each step a thick, sucking sound that punctuated the distant, mournful call of a caged animal. A thick stench, a layered perfume of wet hay, animal waste, and frying onions, hung heavy in the air, a permanent resident of Marius Vane's circus of myth. The colorful banners, depicting roaring griffins and soaring dragons, were slick with grime and drooped like weeping willows. They promised wonder, they delivered rot. Cora Jenkins adjusted the strap of her worn leather satchel on her shoulder. The metal clasps were cold against her knuckles. Inside, syringes, vials of antibiotics, and rolls of sterile gauze jostled against one another. Her work was a constant, losing battle against infection and despair. She passed the long, windowless train car that housed the menagerie, the air growing thick with a cacophony of growls, hisses, and scratches against steel. She did not need to see inside. The sounds painted a vivid enough picture. Her destination was the rearmost wagon, a vehicle that stood apart from the others. It had no garish paintings on its sides, no promise of spectacle. It was a stark, windowless box of riveted iron, painted a flat, functional gray. A single, smoking chimney pipe jutted from its roof, releasing thin plumes of acrid, chemical-scented smoke into the damp air. The crew called it the alchemical wagon. It was Dr. Otto Jayman's domain. It was the place hope went to be dissected. She pushed open the heavy iron door, its hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was warm and sterile, a stark contrast to the world outside. The smell of antiseptic fought a losing war with something deeper, something metallic and raw. The walls were lined with immaculate steel cabinets and racks of gleaming glassware. Beakers and distillation coils caught the light of the humming fluorescent bulbs overhead. In the center of the wagon stood a steel operating table, its surface scarred with countless fine lines. Drain channels ran along its edges, stained a permanent rust brown. Dr. Jayman stood hunched over a workbench, his back to the door. He was a small, precise man, his balding head fringed with white hair. He wore a heavy leather apron over a pristine white shirt. He did not turn. "You are late, Miss Jenkins," he said. His voice was a dry rasp, clipped with a heavy German accent. He held a pair of long, delicate forceps, using them to adjust something small and glistening under the bright light of a task lamp. "The mud is deep, Doctor," Cora replied, setting her satchel down on a small, clear patch of counter space. She began to pull out her own supplies, arranging them with practiced efficiency. Had to sedate the manticore again. Rusk was working himself into a state, rubbing his stump raw on the bars. "The manticore is a failed specimen, a monument to poor acquisition," Jayman stated, his attention fixed on his work. "Its value is purely atmospheric. Let it rot." Cora bit her tongue. Arguing was pointless. To Jayman, the creatures were not animals. They were assets, collections of unique biological data. Their pain was an unfortunate but acceptable operational expense. "What is the procedure today?" "Toxin extraction, the basilisk." A cold knot formed in her stomach. Ophion, he's not due for another month. The stress of the last extraction nearly stopped his heart. "The schedule has been accelerated." Jayaman finally placed his forceps down with a sharp click and turned. His eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, were small and devoid of any warmth. They were the eyes of a watchmaker studying a gear, not a doctor studying a patient. The ringmaster has a new project, a grand design. It requires fresh components. The door creaked open again. This time the man who entered filled the frame. Marius Vane did not walk into the wagon so much as he possessed it. He was tall and slender, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed impossibly clean amidst the circus filth. His silver hair was combed neatly from his brow, and his face was a mask of placid control. He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression that did not reach his pale eyes. "Dr. Jayaman, Miss Jenkins," Vane said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that seemed to absorb the ambient noise. He ran a gloved finger along the edge of a steel cabinet, inspecting it for dust. He found none. "I trust the preparations are proceeding." "As you command, ringmaster," Jayaman replied, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. Vane's gaze drifted to Cora. It was a heavy, analytical look, as if he were assessing the structural integrity of a support beam. "Miss Jenkins, your work with the acquisitions is adequate. Your sentimentality, however, is a liability. You must learn to see beyond the vessel, beyond the flesh and the fur and the fear." He stepped toward the center of the wagon, circling the operating table like a shark. "We are not zookeepers here. We are not wardens. We are artists. The sculptor sees the angel in the marble. I see the future in the gristle and bone of the past. We are on the cusp of creating a new legacy. A living myth born not of whispered stories, but of science and will." He stopped, his back to Cora. He seemed to be addressing the stained steel table itself. "Legacy is not about preservation, Doctor. It is about creation, true, violent, undeniable creation." Cora remained silent, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel Jayaman's sharp gaze on her, warning her. Vane turned his head slightly, his pale eyes fixing on her. "Your next task is critical. You will assist Dr. Jayaman in preparing the dam, the Hydra." Cora's breath caught in her throat. The Hydra, the matron of Lerna, was the most dangerous creature in the menagerie. Kept in a sealed, subterranean tank beneath its own fortified wagon, it was a being of pure, primal rage. No one went near it without Vane's direct command. "The Hydra," she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. "For what purpose?" Vane gave another one of his thin smiles. He gestured toward the operating table. "For a union, Miss Jenkins, a most unhallowed union. We are going to make a god, and every god requires a mother." He looked at Jayaman. "And a father, see to the griffin. Ensure Kalen is healthy, strong. We will need his compliance." With that, he turned and exited the wagon, the heavy door closing behind him with a sound of absolute finality. Cora was left in the sterile silence, the scent of antiseptic, and the cold, horrifying weight of the ringmaster's ambition. Jayaman had already turned his back, picking up his forceps once more. "You have your instructions, Miss Jenkins," the doctor said, his voice flat. "Do not be late again." Chapter 2: The Broken Sire. Kalen's enclosure was a cathedral of misery. The bars were as thick as a man's arm, forged of iron and inscribed with faint, glowing runes that flickered with a sickly purple light. The floor was a bed of sour straw and splintered bones from past feedings. The griffin himself was a study in fallen majesty. He was perched on a massive, log-like beam, his lion's body slumped with a weariness that went bone-deep. His tawny fur was matted in places, scarred in others. His great, feathered wings were folded tight against his back, but Cora could see where the left one had been broken and healed incorrectly, the feathers fanning out at an awkward, painful-looking angle. He could never fly again. His eagle's head, once noble, now drooped, and one of his sharp, golden eyes was clouded with a milky white cataract. He was a king dethroned and thrown in a dungeon. Cora approached the enclosure slowly, her boots squelching in the mud. She did not carry the tools of a vet. She carried a bucket. Inside was a large, freshly butchered side of beef, still bloody. "Kalan," she said softly. Her voice was calm, even. She had learned early on that any sign of fear or aggression would be met with the same from the captives. The griffin's good eye swiveled to fix on her. His head lifted slightly. A low rumble started deep in his chest, a sound like grinding stones. It was not a growl of aggression. It was a sound of profound sadness. She unlatched a small, reinforced slot at the bottom of the cage. It was barely large enough to slide the meat through. As she worked the heavy bolt, another figure emerged from the shadows between the wagons. "Feeding the overgrown chicken, Jenkins." Cora didn't need to turn. The voice was unmistakable. Gunnar Gunny Flinch stood there, a coil of thick rope in one hand and his signature whip in the other. The whip was a nasty thing, its leather braided with what he claimed were manticore whiskers, designed to inflict a pain that festered with venomous magic. He was a broad, slovenly man with a perpetually sneering expression and small, cruel eyes. "He needs to maintain his strength, Gunny," Cora said, not taking her eyes off the griffin. She pushed the heavy slab of meat through the slot. Kalan shifted on his perch. He hopped down, his massive lion paws landing with a soft thud in the soiled straw. He ignored the meat. His good eye was fixed on Flinch. The rumbling in his chest deepened, taking on a harder, more threatening edge. His eagle's beak opened slightly, revealing a sharp, hooked tip. Flinch chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "Still got some fight in him, eh? Don't you worry, Feather Duster. The ringmaster's got plans for you, big plans." He took a step closer to the cage, slapping the coiled whip against his thigh. The sound was sharp like a gunshot. Kalan flinched violently. He shuffled backward, his broken wing scraping against the iron bars with a terrible screech of feather on metal. A pained squawk escaped his beak. "Leave him be, Flinch," Cora snapped, her voice sharp. She straightened up, turning to face the tamer. "Vane wants him healthy. Your games aren't helping." "My games are what keeps this whole freak show from tearing us all limb from limb," Flinch retorted, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the ground near Cora's boot. "It's called respect. You teach it to M early, and often." He grinned, showing brown-stained teeth. "Besides, I'm just here to check the restraints. Jayaman's orders. Seems old Kalan's got a date tonight." Cora's blood ran cold. A date. Vane's words echoed in her mind. "Ensure Kalan is healthy. We will need his compliance." The father. Flinch sauntered over to the side of the cage, inspecting the heavy chains bolted to the floor. Gotta make sure he's nice and secure for the little procedure. Can't have him getting any romantic ideas and taking the good doctor's head off. Cora turned her attention back to Kaelan. The griffin had retreated to the furthest corner of his enclosure. He had lowered his head, pressing it against the cold iron bars. He was trembling. He hadn't touched the meat. His spirit wasn't just broken, it was being systematically ground into dust. This was what Vane called compliance. She waited until Flinch, satisfied with the chains, had swaggered off toward the next cage, whistling a tuneless, discordant melody. She knelt by the bars again. "Kaelan," she whispered, "eat, please. You have to keep your strength." The griffin did not move. He simply stared into the middle distance with his one good eye, lost in a memory of open skis and winds that did not stink of rot and decay. Cora felt a familiar, useless anger rise in her chest. She was a healer forced to witness torture, a veterinarian in an abattoir. She was complicit. Her salary was paid in the currency of this creature's suffering. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the mud, speaking to him in low, soothing tones. Eventually, after the sun had begun to set and the gaudy lights of the circus began to flicker on, casting long, dancing shadows, Kaelan moved. He limped slowly toward the side of beef. He tore at it with a detached, mechanical air, eating without hunger, fueling a body his mind had long since abandoned. As she walked away, leaving him to his grim meal, she passed the Hydra's wagon. It was different from the others, shorter, wider, and sunk low on its axles as if struggling under an immense weight. There were no decorative banners on this one, only stark block-letter warnings stenciled in red paint: lethal specimen, acidic PROPERTIES, non-biological regeneration, maintain distance. A heavy, industrial humming emanated from within, the sound of massive pumps and filtration systems. Vents near the top of the wagon released clouds of steam that smelled of chlorine and something else, something ancient and reptilian. The ground around the wagon was strangely barren, the mud cooked into a hard, cracked clay. Cora paused, her hand resting on the cold, damp metal of a nearby support pole. From inside the wagon she heard a sound that was not mechanical. It was a chorus of wet, hateful hisses, overlapping and discordant. It was the sound of 100 venomous thoughts given voice. Then a loud, percussive thump echoed from within, as if something immense had slammed against the interior wall of the tank. The entire wagon shuddered. She took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Vane's plan was not just cruel, it was insane. To take the soul of the sky and force it upon the monster from the swamp. To mix pride with primal rage. Whatever came from such a union would not be a god. It would be an abomination. Chapter 3: The Unhallowed Union. The surgical theater was Vane's inner sanctum, a place few of the crew had ever seen. It occupied an entire custom-built train car, positioned directly between the alchemical wagon and the Hydra's mobile tank. Access was through a pressurized airlock door that hissed open and shut, sealing the sterile environment within from the circus filth without. Inside, the light was brilliant and shadowless, reflecting off walls of polished steel. The air was cold and recycled, carrying the sharp scent of ozone. In the center of the room, Kalen was chained to a massive, custom-built gurney. His legs were bound in heavy, runeched manacles. His wings were strapped down. A thick leather harness crisscrossed his chest, and his head was held fast in a padded vise, his beak muzzled. He was utterly immobile. His one good eye darted around the room, wide with terror. A low, continuous whimper emanated from his throat, a sound of pure, helpless misery. Cora stood beside the gurney, her job to monitor the griffin's vitals on a humming console. The readings were a chaotic symphony of fear, heart rate dangerously elevated, respiration shallow and rapid. She had administered a powerful sedative, but Kaelin's terror was fighting it, burning through the drug's effects. "His heart rate is spiking," she said, her voice tight. "He could go into cardiac arrest." Dr. Jayaman, dressed in a full surgical gown, mask, and goggles, barely glanced up from a tray of gleaming, terrifyingly intricate instruments. "Irrelevant. The specimen is strong. He will survive the procedure. Increase the sedative drip, but only by 5%. We need his systems functional, not comatose." Cora adjusted the dial, her hand trembling slightly. Kaelin's whimpering subsided into a weak, guttural clicking. His eye began to glaze over. Marius Vane stood in the corner of the room, observing. He was not in surgical attire. He wore his immaculate black suit, a silent, dark figure against the sterile white light. He looked upon the scene with the detached curiosity of a patron in a gallery. "Magnificent, is it not, Doctor?" Vane said, his voice calm and conversational. The raw, untamed power of the mythic laid bare upon the altar of progress. The very building blocks of legends, ready to be repurposed. "The genetic material is potent, ringmaster," Jayaman replied, selecting a long, needle-thin probe from his tray. "The compatibility is theoretically viable, though the resulting phenotype is unpredictable." "Unpredictability is the very soul of art, Doctor," Vane countered smoothly. "Perfection is sterile. I desire a masterpiece, not a replica." A section of the wall slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a thick, reinforced pane of glass. Beyond it lay the Hydra's tank. The water was murky, illuminated from within by a sickly green light. The creature was a writhing mass of serpentine necks and snapping jaws. Dozens of heads, each one ending in a crown of venomous-looking spines, darted through the water, their unblinking, yellow eyes filled with a cold, ancient malice. Jayaman approached a control panel next to the window. "Commencing extraction," he announced. A network of robotic arms descended into the tank. The Hydra exploded into a frenzy. It lunged at the arms, its many heads striking like a barrage of living spears. Jaws snapped shut on metal, and the sound of teeth scraping on steel echoed through the surgical theater. The arms were relentless. One pinned the Hydra's central mass to the floor of the tank while others targeted specific necks. A pincer snapped shut around one serpentine head, holding it fast. Another arm, tipped with a large rotating blade, spun to life. Cora had to look away. The sound was sickening, a wet, violent crunch followed by a high-pitched, multi-toned shriek of fury that vibrated through the glass. On her monitor, Kaelin's vitals went wild, a jagged landscape of panicked spikes. "Hold him steady, Miss Jenkins," Jayaman barked. Cora injected another, stronger sedative directly into the griffin's thigh muscle. Kaelan's body went rigid. A shudder ran through him, and then he went limp against his restraints. His eye closed. In the tank, the severed hydra neck was already regenerating. A new, smaller head bubbling forth from the stump with unnatural speed. The robotic arm holding the severed head retracted, moving it through a decontamination chamber before presenting it to a port next to the window. Jayaman manipulated a set of controls, and a new series of instruments went to work on the severed head, drilling into its base. A thick, opalescent fluid was drawn out by a powerful vacuum and fed through a series of tubes into a complex filtering apparatus beside him. Gamete extraction successful. Purification process initiated, Jayaman stated. He turned his attention to his instrument tray, now selecting a formidable-looking syringe, its needle at least a foot long. The purified fluid, now a glowing, pale green liquid, began to fill the syringe's chamber. "The moment of conception," Vane whispered from the corner, a note of genuine reverence in his voice. "The precise instant a new story begins, a story written in blood and sinew." Jayaman approached the prone form of the griffin. He was all business, his movements economical and precise. He ignored the creature's dignity, seeing only a biological machine with an input port. He swabbed a patch of Kaelan's exposed abdomen with antiseptic. "This is wrong," Cora heard herself say. The words were quiet, but in the sterile room they sounded like a shout. Vane's head snapped toward her. His placid expression did not change, but his eyes hardened into chips of ice. "Your opinion is noted, Miss Jenkins, and discarded. You are here to monitor the equipment. Do your job." Jayaman did not pause. He took the long needle, aimed for a precise point on the griffin's lower abdomen, and with a single, firm motion, plunged it deep into the creature's body. Kaelan's sedated form convulsed violently, a muffled shriek of agony escaping his muzzled beak. His wings strained against their bonds, and the sound of tearing muscle filled the room. Cora watched the glowing green fluid drain from the syringe, disappearing into the griffin's body. She saw the fusion of two fundamental opposites, a violation so profound it felt as though the world itself should have shuddered to a halt. But nothing happened. There was only the quiet hum of the machinery, the pained breathing of the griffin, and the soft, satisfied sigh from Marius Vane in the corner. Jayaman withdrew the needle and tossed it into a disposal bin with a clatter. "Insemination complete. The rest is a matter of biology and luck." "Luck is the residue of design, Doctor," Vane said, stepping forward. He looked down at the violated griffin, then at the furious, writhing mass in the tank. "We have designed something magnificent. Now we simply wait for it to be born." Chapter 4: The Vile Gestation. Weeks bled into one another, each day marked by the same gray sky and clinging mud. The circus moved twice, packing its miseries into the long train and unpacking them again in new, equally dismal fields outside of new, equally forgettable towns. For Cora, the world had shrunk to the space between Kaelan's cage and the oppressive shadow of the alchemical wagon. The procedure had left its scars, both visible and not. Kalen was a ghost. He no longer rumbled or growled. He barely ate the meat Cora brought him, picking at it with a listless disinterest. Most of the day he simply sat on his perch, his good eye fixed on nothing, a living statue of despair. The fire within him was gone, extinguished by a violation he could not comprehend. The Hydra, by contrast, was a storm of focused rage. The water in her tank was perpetually churning, and the sounds from her wagon were more violent than ever. She slammed against the walls of her prison relentlessly, as if trying to tear her way out through sheer force of will. Jayaman had tripled her food allotment, dumping whole carcasses into the tank, which were torn apart in seconds by the maelstrom of snapping heads. She was eating for two, or for something far, far worse. Cora's duties now included daily examinations of the griffin. Under Jayaman's cold, watchful eye, she would draw blood, take temperature readings, and use a portable ultrasound device to monitor the unthinkable growth within him. It was a grotesque parody of veterinary medicine. The egg grew at an unnatural rate. Kalen's body, not designed for such a thing, was wasting away, the growth siphoning the life from him. His fur grew thin, his muscles atrophied. He was being consumed from the inside out. The vessel is degrading faster than projected, Jayaman noted one afternoon, studying the readings on Cora's monitor. He showed no concern, only clinical interest. The hybrid's metabolic demands are extraordinary. He's dying, Cora stated flatly. All birth requires sacrifice, Marius Vane said. He had taken to appearing during the examinations, his presence a constant, oppressive weight. Kalen is fulfilling his historic purpose. He should be honored. Finally, the day came. Kalen, now skeletal and weak, collapsed from his perch. His breathing was ragged, his body racked with violent, unnatural contractions. Under Vane's excited direction, Flinch and a team of burly roustabouts used long, electrified poles to herd the agonized griffin into a smaller, heavily reinforced transport cage. They moved him to the surgical theater, the only place secure enough to contain the birth. Cora was ordered to administer stimulants to keep Kalen's heart beating long enough to expel the egg. She worked on autopilot, her hands moving with a precision her mind refused to acknowledge. She was no longer a healer. She was a mechanic, keeping a failing engine running for one last, terrible task. The birth was a bloody, horrific affair that lasted for hours. Kalen's shrieks, raw and desperate, echoed through the steel room, a sound of an agony that transcended the physical. When it was over, the griffin lay broken and barely breathing. And in the center of the room, nestled in a bed of blood-soaked straw, was the egg. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It was larger than any griffin egg should be, with the ovoid shape of a reptile's. Its shell was not the chalky white of a bird, but a slick, mottled green and bronze like oxidized metal. It was strangely warm to the touch, and if you placed a hand on its surface, you could feel a slow, powerful, rhythmic pulse from within. It did not feel like a new life. It felt like a bomb. The egg became the circus's dark star. Vane had a custom incubator built for it in the surgical theater, a chamber of glass and steel that regulated temperature and humidity with obsessive precision. Jayaman monitored it constantly, his clinical detachment giving way to a kind of feverish anticipation. Kaelan was unceremoniously returned to his cage, where he lay in the corner, refusing all food, waiting for death. Cora was granted a small mercy. Vane, consumed by his impending masterpiece, left her to her own devices. She spent her days tending to the other creatures, her anger and guilt a cold, hard stone in her gut. She would stand outside Kaelan's cage, speaking to him, trying to coax him to eat, but it was no use. His good eye, when it opened, was vacant. One night, unable to sleep, she found herself drawn back to the surgical car. A single light burned within. Peering through the thick glass of the porthole window on the door, she could see Jayaman inside, silhouetted against the glowing incubator. He had a stethoscope pressed against the egg's shell, his head cocked as if listening to a secret. Driven by an impulse she did not understand, Cora slipped around to the side of the car, to the access panel for the ventilation system. Jade Sparks, the anxious engineer, had once shown her how to bypass the lock, a trick for emergencies. Her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled with the mechanism. It clicked open. Inside was a small grate. It would offer a limited view, but it was away from the door. She pressed her face to the cold metal, peering into the sterile room. She could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping from the egg, even through the steel. And then she heard another sound, a soft, high-pitched crack. Jayaman straightened up, his attention snapping to the incubator. Another crack, louder this time. A thin, dark line appeared on the egg's mottled surface. Then another, and another. The rhythmic thumping grew faster, more frantic. A web of cracks spread across the shell. A foul, ozone and ammonia smell began to drift from the grate. Jayaman took a cautious step backward, his face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. With a final, sickening crunch, a large piece of the shell broke away and fell into the incubator's sterile bedding. Something wet and dark moved in the opening. It was not the beak of a chick or the snout of a reptile. It was a tangle of something thin and serpentine, writhing like a nest of worms. From her vantage point, Cora watched in frozen horror as the creature struggled its way out of the shattered shell. This was the moment Vane had orchestrated, the culmination of his mad art, the birth of his new god, and it was a horror beyond all imagining. Chapter 5, Progenitus. The thing that slithered from the ruins of the egg was a blasphemy of biology. It was nothing like the proud majesty of its sire or the cold, primal power of its dam. It was a collage of mistakes, a creature born of pain and stitched together by madness. Its body was roughly the size of a large turkey, but misshapen, hunched, and asymmetrical. It was covered in a sparse, patchy coat of wet, black feathers, like tarred quills, that clung to a hide of slick, reptilian scales. The scales shimmered with the same sickly green bronze as the eggshell, catching the sterile light in nauseating waves. One of its forelimbs was a griffin's, ending in sharp, curved talons that scrabbled uselessly at the floor of the incubator. The other was a stunted, malformed reptilian limb, its claws webbed and weak. It dragged its hindquarters, a lion's body that was too small and frail, twitching with spasms. But the head was the true horror. It had the beaked maw of a bird of prey, but the beak was split, like a cracked mandible, revealing rows of needle-thin reptilian teeth within. Its eyes were large, round, and jet black without pupils, reflecting the light with the dead sheen of obsidian. And sprouting from its shoulders, where a griffin's wings should have been, were two vestigial, serpentine necks. They were no thicker than a man's thumb, and they ended not in fully formed heads, but in raw, puckered mouths that opened and closed spasmodically, emitting silent, whimpering gasps. The creature's first real sound was a cry that tore through the sterile silence of the room. It was a sound that should not exist, a discordant hybrid of a hawk's shrill screech and a hydra's wet, sibilant hiss. It was the sound of agony made manifest. Through the grate, Cora felt the cry in her teeth, a vibration that settled deep in her bones. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp, her stomach churning. Inside the room, Dr. Jamin watched, his earlier apprehension replaced by a look of intense, scientific fascination. He scribbled furiously in a notebook, his pen scratching across the page. "Incredible," he muttered to himself, his voice tight with excitement. "The genetic recombination is more chaotic than anticipated. The secondary heads are underdeveloped but present. Neural activity appears, fractured." Marius Vane entered the room, drawn by the creature's cry. He strode to the incubator and stared down at the trembling, misshapen hatchling. He was not horrified. He was enraptured. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the most terrifying expression Cora had ever seen on him. "Oh, you are magnificent," Vane breathed. He spoke to the creature as a father speaks to a newborn child. A perfect paradox, flawed, wretched, a symphony of errors. You are the future. The hybrid shuddered, trying to pull itself into a corner of the incubator. It was clearly in immense pain, its body a prison of conflicting instincts and faulty wiring. One of the small, vestigial heads bit down on its own shoulder, drawing a thin trickle of dark, viscous blood. "It appears to be in distress," Jamin observed clinically. "The nervous system is likely overwhelmed. I recommend a mild tranquilizer. We need to document its initial state before it injures itself further." "No," Vane said, his voice firm. He did not take his eyes off the creature. "No tranquilizers. Pain is a teacher. It will forge it. It will make it strong. Let it feel everything. Let it learn what it is." The hybrid's main head swiveled, its black, depthless eyes fixing on Vane. It hissed, a sound full of venom and misery, and lunged weakly at the glass, its beak clacking uselessly against the transparent barrier. Vane laughed, a soft, delighted sound. "Yes, there it is. The fury of the matron, the pride of the sky is buried deep, but it is there. We will coax it out." He turned to Jamin, his eyes alight with a fanatical fire. "It needs a name, not a designation. A name, a title for the first of a new age." He placed his gloved hand on the glass of the incubator, directly in front of the wretched creature. The hybrid recoiled, hissing. "We will call it progenitus," Vane declared, his voice ringing with triumph. "The firstborn, the beginning of my great work." Cora pulled back from the grate, her body shaking uncontrollably. She stumbled away from the surgical car, her mind reeling. The name echoed in her thoughts, progenitus. It was not a name, it was a label, a word for a thing, not a life. She looked across the muddy grounds toward the dark, silent shape of Kaelen's cage. The father abandoned and dying, she thought of the furious monster in the tank. The mother used and contained, and now this child, an abomination born of their mutual torture. Vane had not created a god, he had weaponized suffering. He had given it claws and a beak and a scream that could curdle blood, and it was just a hatchling. Cora stared at her trembling hands, the hands of a healer. She thought of the syringes in her bag, the vials of sedatives, the potent drugs meant to ease pain, and the others, the ones meant to stop a heart cleanly and without struggle. For the first time, she considered a different kind of healing, a mercy, for Kaelan, for the creature, and for the world that was not ready for the day Progenitus grew up. Chapter 6, The First Lesson. The days following the hatching were a quiet storm. The circus packed up and moved again, the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels a constant, percussive beat beneath the growing tension. Progenitus was Vane's sole focus. The ringmaster spent hours in the surgical car, simply observing the creature he had made. He would speak to it in low, soothing tones, his voice a chilling counterpoint to the hybrid's constant, agonized whimpers. Progenitus grew at a terrifying, unnatural pace. Within a week, it had doubled in size. Its patchy feathers began to fill in, but they were stiff and oily, more like a crow's than a griffin's. The scales on its hide became harder, more defined, taking on the iridescent sheen of a snake's belly. The two serpentine heads on its shoulders grew longer, thicker, their underdeveloped mouths now capable of opening and closing with a wet, popping sound. They seemed to have no eyes, but they swiveled and tasted the air, reacting to movement and sound with a disturbing, independent intelligence. The creature was a biological impossibility, constantly at war with itself. Its avian and reptilian metabolisms were in direct conflict. It would shiver with a deep, internal cold one moment, then its skin would grow hot to the touch the next, steam rising from its scales. It suffered from seizures, its mismatched limbs convulsing as its fractured nervous system sent contradictory signals. Cora was tasked with its feeding. It was a role she dreaded, one that forced her into the sterile room with the abomination each day. Jayaman had designed a nutritional slurry, a foul-smelling, protein-rich gruel that was pumped into the incubator through a tube. Progenitus refused it. It would attack the feeding tube, its split beak snapping at the metal, its talons scratching furiously at the floor. "It will not eat," Cora reported to Vane one afternoon, standing just inside the airlock, as far from the incubator as she could get. "It's starving itself. Its energy reserves are dangerously low." Vane stood before the glass, his hands clasped behind his back. Progenitus was huddled in a corner, its main head tucked beneath its malformed reptilian limb, trembling. "It rejects the manufactured," Vane observed, a thoughtful tone in his voice. "It craves the raw, the hunt." "It's a hatchling in a glass box," Cora countered, her voice sharp with frustration. "There is no hunt." "Then we shall provide one," Vane said, turning to her. His eyes held that familiar, unsettling gleam of a new idea taking root. "It is time for its first lesson." He gave the order to flinch. The tamer, reeking of cheap whiskey and self-satisfaction, returned a half-hour later dragging a burlap sack. The sack wriggled and let out a series of frantic, high-pitched squeals. A fresh catch from the local dump ringmaster, Flinch announced, grinning. A whole nest of 'em. Vane nodded. Excellent. Jayaman opened the port. Dr. Jayaman, ever the obedient functionary, manipulated a control panel. A small, circular hatch slid open on the side of the incubator. Flinch appended the sack, and a half-dozen large, terrified rats tumbled into the sterile enclosure. The effect on progenitus was instantaneous and horrific. The creature, which had been lethargic and trembling, sprang to life. It uncoiled with a speed that defied its clumsy, asymmetrical body. Its main head shot forward, the split beak snapping shut on one of the rats with a sickening crunch of bone. It did not swallow. It held the dying, twitching rodent in its maw, its black eyes fixed on the others. The two serpentine heads on its shoulders suddenly became animated. They darted forward like striking snakes, their tiny, gasping mouths latching onto another of the rats. The rat screamed, a shrill sound of terror and pain, as the two heads began to pull it in opposite directions, a gruesome tug-of-war. The remaining rats scrambled, trying to find an escape from the glass prison. Progenitus was a whirlwind of clumsy, brutal violence. It stomped with its taloned foot, pinning one. It lashed out with its reptilian limb, cornering another. There was no grace, no efficiency. It was a messy, chaotic slaughter, driven by a desperate, explosive hunger. Cora watched, her stomach heaving. This was not the predatory instinct of a griffin or the cold efficiency of a hydra. This was something else. This was rage feeding itself. The creature was not just killing to eat. It was killing because it could. It was exercising the only power it had in a world that had caused it nothing but pain. When it was over, the floor of the incubator was smeared with blood and viscera. Progenitus stood panting in the center of the carnage, its feathers and scales slick with gore. It finally began to eat, tearing at the mangled carcasses with a ravenous hunger. Vane watched the spectacle with rapt approval. You see, Miss Jenkins, it needed a purpose, a motivation. The matron's blood runs true. It is a predator. It's a monster, Cora whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Vane's gaze shifted to her, his smile faded. Do not mistake a lack of elegance for a lack of design. This is a necessary stage. All great things are born from chaos. We are witnessing the forging of a weapon, and a weapon must be blooded. He turned to Flinch. Double the acquisitions. I want a steady supply. The child is hungry. As Cora fled the surgical car, the image of the slaughter was burned into her mind. She ran, not to her own small quarters, but to Kaelan's cage. The griffin lay in the far corner, a still, skeletal shape in the encroaching dusk. The sounds from the circus, the tinny music, the distant laughter of the crowd felt like a profanity. She knelt in the mud by the bars, her hand resting on the cold iron. "Kaelan," she said, her voice choked. "I'm so sorry." For the first time in weeks, the griffin stirred. He lifted his great eagle head, a movement that seemed to cost him a tremendous effort. He turned and looked at her with his one good eye. The vacancy was gone. In its place was a look of profound, heart-wrenching intelligence, a clear and final understanding. He knew. He knew what he had sired. He knew what was happening in the sterile wagon across the grounds. A single, clear tear welled in the corner of his eye and traced a path through the grime on his feathers. He let out a soft, low sound, a noise that was not a whimper or a growl, but a sigh of utter defeat. Then he lowered his head, rested it on the soiled straw, and closed his eye. Cora stayed with him as darkness fell completely. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that he would not lift his head again. She was watching the last of the sky die, overshadowed by the birth of a new terrestrial hell. Chapter 7. The Whispers of Puckett. The death of Kaelan was a quiet, unceremonious event. Cora found him the next morning, still and cold in the corner of his cage. There was no final struggle, no sign of pain. He had simply let go. His passing went largely unnoticed. Vane, when informed, merely shrugged. The vessel served its purpose. Dispose of it. Flinch and his crew handled the task with their usual callous efficiency, hauling the griffin's body away on a flatbed cart. For them, it was just another piece of spoiled meat. For Cora, it was a final, severing snap of a thread she hadn't realized she was still holding onto. Her complicity now felt like a physical weight, a shroud she could not shrug off. Her grief and anger festered, driving her to walk the perimeter of the circus grounds late at night, long after the crowds had gone and a semblance of quiet had fallen. It was on one of these aimless, desperate wanderings that she found herself near the smaller cages, the ones holding the less spectacular, more manageable captives. From one of the cages, a soft, mournful melody drifted through the night air. It was a tune played on a cheap, tinny-sounding fiddle, but the notes themselves held an impossible depth of sorrow. She followed the sound to the cage of Puckett, the satyr. He sat on a small wooden stool, his goat-like legs crossed. His face, with its small horns peeking through a shock of curly hair, was etched with a sadness that seemed ancient. His fingers, nimble and sure, danced on the neck of the fiddle, coaxing a heart-breaking lament from its strings. He stopped playing as she approached, his dark, intelligent eyes fixing on her. "He is gone, then," the satyr said. His voice was like rustling leaves and old earth. It was not a question. "The Sky King, I felt his light go out." Cora stared at him, surprised. The keepers rarely spoke to the captives as anything more than animals. "You knew." "We all know," Puckett replied, his gaze sweeping across the row of cages where other creatures stirred in the darkness. "We hear the whispers on the wind. We feel the vibrations in the earth. This place has a loud voice, healer. It screams." He set his fiddle aside. "You carry a heavy heart. The Sky King's death is a part of it, but there is a new shadow that makes it heavier." "Progenitus," Cora breathed the name. The satyr flinched, as if the word itself was a physical blow. A name of blasphemy, a word that should not be spoken. It is a knot in the weave of things, a tangle of rage and sorrow. It has no place in the world. "Vane calls it a masterpiece," Cora said bitterly. "The man is a fool," Puckett scoffed. "He thinks he is a creator, but he is merely a vandal. He breaks beautiful things and glues the pieces together in ugly shapes. He does not understand the power he is toying with. The mother's blood is old and cold and remembers the abyss. The father's blood remembers the sun and the endless sky. To mix them is to invite a war into a single body. A war that will consume the body and then spill out to consume everything else. Cora moved closer to the cage, her voice low. What can be done? Puckett looked at her, his gaze sharp and appraising. You are a healer. Your hands are meant to mend, but some wounds are too deep. Some sicknesses cannot be cured, they can only be ended. He picked a loose piece of straw from his hairy leg and studied it. There are ways, old ways, poisons that do not taste of poison, powders that bring on a sleep from which there is no waking. The suggestion hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Euthanasia, mercy-killing. The words Cora had been afraid to form in her own mind. He is Vane's obsession, she said, her thoughts racing. The security around the surgical car is absolute. Jayaman never leaves it for long. The alchemist is a man of routine, the satyr mused. And the ringmaster is a man of ego. He will want to show off his creation. He will want to see it test its strength against something worthy. Puckett's eyes glinted in the dim light. The Fenrir wolf sleeps, but his dreams are of the hunt. The basilisk is blind, but his venom is no less potent. The matron in her tank, she feels her child's pain. She rages. This place is a barrel of gunpowder healer. Vane is playing with matches, and you have access to the flame. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There is a root. Nightshade is a child's toy next to it. It is called Gorgon's blood. It grows only in the shadow of a petrified thing. It does not kill with poison. It kills with silence. It stops the heart, calms the mind, and severs the soul from the flesh, clean as a knife's cut. It is a mercy. Where would I find such a thing? Puckett smiled, a sad, knowing expression. The basilisk, Ophion, he has been here a long time. The ground beneath his cage is soaked in his power. It is stone. And in the deepest shadow, under the filth and straw, something grows. Something only a healer with a steady hand and a strong will might dare to harvest. A cold resolve began to form in Cora's heart. It was a terrifying, liberating feeling. She was no longer just a witness. Puckett's words had given her a path, a dark and dangerous one, but a path nonetheless. Be careful, healer, the satyr said, his voice once again soft and sorrowful. He picked up his fiddle. The walls have ears, and the serpent sisters have no heart to weigh them down. As he began to play another mournful tune, Cora slipped away into the darkness. Her mind was no longer on healing. It was on sourcing an ingredient. Her destination was the basilisk's cage, and her purpose was to find a root that could offer the ultimate, silent mercy. Chapter 8. The Shadow of the Basilisk. Ophion's wagon was a place of palpable dread. Unlike the other enclosures, it was completely enclosed, a rolling black box with no windows and a single, heavy, vault-like door. The air around it was cold and still, and the ground was a barren patch of cracked, gray earth where not even weeds would grow. A faint, petrifying aura radiated from the wagon, a magical contamination that leached the life from its surroundings. Cora waited until the deepest point of the night, when the only sounds were the distant rumble of a passing train and the hum of the circus's generator. She had her satchel, but it contained none of her usual supplies. Tonight, it held a small trowel, a pair of thick leather gauntlets, and a lead-lined box she had salvaged from the X-ray supplies in the alchemical wagon. Approaching the wagon felt like walking into a vacuum. The ambient night sound seemed to fade, replaced by a low, humming silence. The basilisk itself was usually quiet, a dormant terror. The true danger was in the lingering magic, the slow petrification that afflicted anything that remained too near for too long. Keepers who cleaned its cage were on a strict time limit, their skin tingling and stiffening if they lingered even a minute too long. The cage floor, as Puckett had said, was not wood or steel. It was a solid slab of what looked like gray stone, but was in fact countless layers of straw, waste, and spilled water that had been slowly petrified over the years. This was the ground where Gorgon's blood might grow. The lock on the main door was massive, but there was a smaller maintenance hatch near the floor, the same kind she used to feed Kale in. Jade Sparks, in a rare moment of drunken candor, had complained about its faulty locking pin. A sharp rap in the right spot, he'd said, and it would slide right open. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she knelt in the strange, dead earth. She pulled a small mallet from her satchel. The sound of the metal striking the pin was deafening in the silence. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft groan, the bolt slid back. The hatch swung inward, opening a sliver of profound darkness. A smell wafted out, dry and dusty, like an ancient tomb, with an undercurrent of something reptilian and sharp. She pulled on the thick gauntlets, her hands sweating inside them. Taking a deep breath, she aimed her small flashlight into the opening. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a small section of the stone-like floor. It was a landscape of gray, unnatural hills and valleys. And there, in the deepest shadow cast by a petrified mound of ancient straw, was a flicker of color. It wasn't a plant, not in the traditional sense. It was a cluster of crystalline growths like shards of black obsidian no larger than her thumb. They grew from a gnarled, root-like structure that was a deep Venus purple. This was it, Gorgon's blood. She had to reach inside. Every instinct screamed at her to flee. The air from the cage felt heavy, oppressive. Her skin began to tingle, a pins and needles sensation that was the first warning sign of petrification. She knew she had only minutes, perhaps less. Holding her breath, she reached in with the trowel. Her arm, up to the elbow, was inside the basilisk's domain. The tingling intensified, a cold stiffness creeping into her fingers. From the far corner of the darkness, she heard a sound, a slow, dry slithering, the sound of immense weight being shifted across stone. Ophion was awake. Panic seized her. Her hand trembled, the trowel chattering against the hard ground. She had to be fast. She dug the tip of the trowel into the petrified earth around the root, trying to pry it loose. The root was tough, resistant. The slithering grew louder, closer. A low, guttural hiss echoed in the enclosed space, a sound that seemed to drain the warmth from her blood. She gave a final, desperate heave with the trowel. The root came free with a sharp crack. She snatched it up with her gloved hand, the black crystals cold and unnaturally heavy. She scrambled backward, pulling her arm from the hatch, her shoulder catching on the edge. A massive, serpentine head moved into the edge of her flashlight beam. It was covered in scales the color of old bronze, each one as large as a silver dollar. Its eyes were sewn shut with thick black cord, the flesh around them puckered and scarred. but it knew she was there. Its forked tongue, black as pitch, flicked out, tasting the air where her arm had been just seconds before. Cora slammed the hatch shut, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. She fumbled with the pin, her fingers numb and clumsy, and finally managed to slide it back into place. She stumbled away from the wagon, her heart a frantic drum in her chest. She leaned against the side of a nearby wagon, sucking in the damp night air, trying to will the feeling back into her arm. The stiffness slowly receded, leaving behind a deep, aching cold. She opened her hand. The Gorgon's blood root lay in her palm, its black crystals seeming to drink the light from her flashlight. It felt ancient, malevolent. It was the essence of a quiet, creeping death. A movement in the shadows caught her eye. Two figures detached themselves from the darkness near the cookhouse. The Serpent sisters, Lyra and Vesper. They were not looking at her. They were looking at the basilisk's wagon, then at each other. They had heard the noise. They stood there for a long moment, their heads tilted in uncanny synchronicity, before melting back into the shadows. Cora's blood ran cold for a different reason. She had not been as quiet as she thought, and the ringmaster's spies missed nothing. She clutched the root, shoved it deep into the lead-lined box in her satchel, and fled back to the anonymity of her small, bleak quarters. She had the weapon, but now she was being watched. The race had begun. Chapter 9: A Calculated Escalation. The Serpent sisters did not confront her. They were more subtle than that. The next morning, as Cora did her rounds, she felt their presence everywhere. A flash of movement at the edge of her vision. A shared, knowing smirk as she passed them practicing their contortions. They were Vane's loyal pets, and they had caught the scent of a new, interesting secret. They were playing with her, letting the fear build. Her plan, as desperate as it was, needed a catalyst. She couldn't simply walk into the surgical car and poison the hybrid. Jayaman was a fixture, and Vane's visits were frequent and unpredictable. She needed a distraction, a crisis, something big enough to pull Vane and his security away, to create an opportunity. Puckett's words came back to her. This place is a barrel of gunpowder. She needed to light a fuse, not a big one, just a small, controlled burn that would force Vane's hand. Her target was the enclosure for the Fenrir wolf. Fen was a beast of incredible power, held in check by chains of sleeping runes. The chains were anchored to a complex locking mechanism controlled by a single, enchanted gear deep within its housing. Jade Sparks, the engineer, was terrified of the wolf and inspected the mechanism daily. Cora had watched him. She knew the sequence. She also knew that Jade had a weakness for the potent, potato-based liquor Boris the Bulgar brewed in a hidden still. That evening, she found Jade near the generator, his face pale with anxiety as he monitored the fluctuating power levels. She offered him a flask. "Long day, Jade?" she asked, her voice casual. He looked at the flask, then at her, his eyes suspicious. "What's this?" "Peace offering. I know things have been tense. Thought you could use it." She had laced the liquor with a powerful, fast-acting sedative from her own supplies. Not enough to kill him, just enough to make him clumsy, forgetful. Jade hesitated, then snatched the flask. "Don't mind if I do." He took a long, desperate swallow. He coughed, his eyes watering. "Strong stuff." "Only the best," Cora replied, watching him take another drink. She left him there, leaning against the humming generator. An hour later, she watched from the shadows as he performed his final checks. He was unsteady on his feet, his movements sluggish. He fumbled with the locking mechanism on the Fenrir enclosure, his hands clumsy. He completed the sequence, but Cora saw what she had hoped for. In his stupor, he failed to reset the final tumbler. The main locking bolt was disengaged. The runic chains still held the wolf in a deep slumber, but the physical lock that anchored them was now vulnerable. The next piece of her plan was Flinch. The tamer was arrogant, violent, and predictable. After the evening show, he always went to the same makeshift tavern the crew had set up, where he would drink himself into a belligerent stupor. Cora found him there, holding court, boasting about how he had tamed a manticore with nothing but a sharp stick and a mean look. "That's nothing," Cora said, stepping into the circle of lamplight. Her voice was loud, challenging. Flinch turned, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say, vet?" "I said that's nothing," she repeated, her heart pounding. She had to provoke him. "The manticore is old and broken. You're just a bully who kicks tired animals. The Fenrir wolf now. There's a real challenge. But you wouldn't dare go near him without his chains locked tight." The insult landed perfectly. Flinch's face flushed with anger. The other roustabouts fell silent, sensing a confrontation. "You think I'm scared of that overgrown mutt?" Flinch snarled, getting to his feet. He was unsteady, swaying slightly. "I think you're terrified," Cora said, her voice cold. "I think you know that without those magic chains, he'd tear you apart and use your spine as a toothpick. I saw the lock on his cage tonight. Looked loose to me. Bet you wouldn't even check it without a half-dozen men behind you." It was a gamble, a huge one, but Flinch's pride was as big as his cruelty. He grabbed his whip from the table. "I'll show you scared, you little witch." He stormed out of the tent, the other crew members following at a safe distance, eager to see the show. Cora slipped away in the opposite direction, her part in this act complete. She didn't need to see what happened next. She heard it. First, Flinch's drunken shouting as he rattled the cage door. Then the loud, metallic clank as the unlocked anchor gave way under his abuse. This was followed by a sound that silenced the entire circus. It was the sound of 3-inch-thick iron chains snapping like thread. A deep, earth-shaking growl rolled across the grounds, a sound of ancient winter and ravenous hunger. The runic magic, severed from its anchor, had shattered. Fen was awake, and he was free. Panic erupted. Shouts, screams, the frantic ringing of an alarm bell. Crew members ran in every direction. It was the chaos she needed. She saw Vane and Boris emerge from the main tent, their faces grim. Vane shouted orders, directing the enforcer and a team of armed keepers toward the source of the chaos. Even the Serpent Sisters were distracted, their heads snapping in the direction of the rampage. This was her chance. With the Gorgon's blood heavy in her satchel and the sounds of the rampaging wolf providing the perfect cover, Cora ran. She did not run from the danger. She ran toward it. Her destination was the surgical car now, she prayed, left unguarded in the beautiful, terrifying chaos she had unleashed. Chapter 10. The Unattended God. The surgical car was an island of sterile silence in an ocean of pandemonium. The sounds of Finn's rampage, the splintering of wood, the tearing of metal, the terrified screams of the crew, were muffled by the thick, insulated walls. The airlock hissed open, and Cora slipped inside, her heart a frantic piston in her chest. She was right, the room was empty. For the first time since the creature's birth, it was completely unattended. Jayaman's meticulous instruments lay neatly arranged on their trays. Vane's observation corner was vacant. The humming monitors were the only sign of life, their screens displaying the hybrid's chaotic vital signs. And in the center of the room, in its large, reinforced glass incubator, was Progenitus. The creature had grown. It was now the size of a large dog, a horrifying sculpture of mismatched parts. Its feathers were thicker, its scales harder. The serpentine heads on its shoulders were now nearly as long as its own arms, their eyeless faces weaving back and forth, tasting the air. They had developed a low, continuous hiss, a sound like escaping steam. The hybrid was agitated by the chaos outside. It paced the confines of its enclosure, its asymmetrical limbs moving in a clumsy, lurching gait. Its main head was up, its black, depthless eyes staring intently at the door, as if it could see the carnage unfolding beyond it. This was her moment, her one perfect chance. Cora pulled the lead-lined box from her satchel. Her hands, protected by the thick gauntlets, trembled as she opened it. The Gorgon's blood root lay inside, its black crystals seeming to absorb the harsh, clinical light of the room, making the shadows around it deeper. She had prepared it as Puckett had instructed, crushing the crystalline growths into a fine, dark powder with a mortar and pestle she'd taken from the alchemical wagon. The plan was simple: introduce the powder into the hybrid's next meal. The creature was fed on a strict schedule. Its evening portion of butchered rats was due any moment, delivered via an automated chute from a refrigerated unit. She just had to get to it first. She found the refrigeration unit, its door unlocked. Inside, a metal tray held several dead white rats, ready for delivery. Working quickly, she coated them in the dark, crystalline powder. The Gorgon's blood clung to the damp fur, rendering the rats a sickly, glittering black. It was a meal fit for a demon. She slid the tray into the delivery chute and activated the sequence. With a low hum, the tray began to move toward the incubator. Cora retreated to the airlock, her hand on the release, ready to flee as soon as the deed was done. The chute opened into the incubator, and the poisoned rats tumbled onto the floor. Progenitus, which had been packing restlessly, stopped. Its main head and its two serpentine heads swiveled in unison toward the food. It approached the rats cautiously, its forked tongue flicking out, tasting the strange, crystalline dust. It cocked its head, a strangely bird-like gesture that was profoundly unsettling in the monstrous creature. It seemed to sense that something was wrong. For a heart-stopping moment, Cora thought it would refuse the meal. Her entire gamble, the freeing of a monster and the risk of her own life, would be for nothing. Then from outside came a sound that shook the very foundations of the train car. It was a deafening roar of pure, triumphant fury, followed by the sound of something immense and heavy collapsing. the main tent pole. The lights in the surgical car flickered violently. The sudden noise and lurch of the car startled Progenitus. Its caution was overwhelmed by its predatory instinct. It lunged. It tore into the poisoned rats with a vicious, frantic hunger, its split beak and serpentine mouths working in a horrifying synergy. It devoured them in seconds, swallowing the black dust along with the flesh and bone. Cora felt a surge of grim, terrible relief. It was done. She watched, waiting for the effects Puckett had described, a quiet, peaceful end, but nothing happened. Progenitus finished its meal and began to pace again, its movements still agitated. The monitors displaying its vitals showed no change, no calm, no silent sleep. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. Had Puckett been wrong? Was the route a lie, a cruel joke played on a desperate woman? Then the creature stopped packing. It stood perfectly still in the center of the incubator. A low, guttural noise rumbled in its chest, a sound deeper and more resonant than any it had made before. It was not a sound of pain. It was a sound of transformation. The hybrid's body began to twitch, then to convulse. But this was not one of its usual seizures. This was something different, something organized. The creature threw back its main head and let out a piercing screech, a sound of agony and ecstasy combined. The two serpentine heads on its shoulders suddenly stiffened. The puckered, vestigial mouths at their ends stretched, tore, and reformed with a series of wet, popping sounds. Skin and cartilage reshaped themselves at an impossible speed. Where there had been only mindless, gasping mouths, two new, fully formed heads now grew, perfect reptilian replicas of the matrons, complete with flickering forked tongues and cold, yellow, unblinking eyes. Cora stared in utter horror. The Gorgon's blood, it wasn't a poison, it was a catalyst, a key. Puckett hadn't lied to her, he had used her. The root didn't grow in the shadow of a petrified thing. It grew in soil soaked with the petrifying magic of a basilisk, a creature whose very essence was tied to the Gorgons of myth. It was not a potion of death. It was a potion of evolution. It was the missing piece of the genetic puzzle, the alchemical component Jamin had failed to synthesize. It had not delivered a mercy. It had unlocked the hybrid's full, horrific potential. On the monitor, the hybrid's vital signs went berserk. Its heart rate tripled. Its body temperature soared. A new, third brainwave pattern appeared, a rhythmic, dominant signal that began to synchronize the other two. The creature, now a true, three-headed monster, slammed its body against the glass of the incubator. The reinforced panel shuddered, and a spiderweb of cracks appeared on its surface. It struck again, a coordinated, powerful blow. The glass groaned, bowing outward. Cora was frozen, trapped between the horror she had unleashed outside and the greater, more intimate horror she had just perfected inside. The alarms in the surgical car began to blare, their shrill cry a death knell. The hybrid drew back, its three heads hissing in perfect, terrible harmony. It gathered its powerful, mismatched limbs. With a final, explosive roar that was part griffin, part hydra, and part something new and terrifying, it lunged. The glass did not just break. It shattered, exploding outward in a shower of deadly shards. Progenitus was free, and its first act of freedom was to turn its three sets of hateful eyes directly on its creator. Chapter 11. The Fury of the Matron. The chaos outside was nothing compared to the focused, intimate violence that erupted within the surgical car. Progenitus, free of its glass prison, landed on the sterile floor with a heavy thud. Shards of glass crunched under its mismatched feet. It was larger than it had appeared in the incubator, its body coiled with a newfound power and coordination. The war within it was over. The Hydra had won. Cora, still standing by the airlock, was paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight. The creature ignored her. Its three heads swiveled, their 6 eyes, 2 of obsidian black, 4 of reptilian yellow, fixing on a single point across the room. The Hydra's tank. With a shriek that was a symphony of predatory rage, Progenitus launched itself toward the wall separating the surgical theater from the tank. It did not try to break the thick observation window. It attacked the wall itself, its griffin talons tearing at the steel plates, its newly functional Hydra heads spitting a thick, viscous fluid. The fluid sizzled and smoked where it hit the metal, eating through the steel like a powerful acid. It was a trait inherited directly from the matron of Lerna, a defense mechanism Vane and Jayaman had never known she possessed. The alarms blared. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into a terrifying darkness punctuated by the emergency strobes and the hellish green glow emanating from the Hydra's tank. The airlock door hissed open behind Cora. Marius Vane and Dr. Jayaman stumbled in, their faces pale and streaked with soot. Jayaman held a heavy, rifle-like object, a tranquilizer gun. Vane's immaculate suit was torn at the shoulder, but his expression was not one of fear. It was one of pure, ecstatic awe. "It has bloomed," Vane breathed, his voice filled with a mad reverence as he stared at the creature dissolving his prized equipment. "More beautiful than I ever imagined." "Ringmaster, it is out of control," Jayaman yelled, raising the tranquilizer gun. "We must sedate it." "No," Vane commanded, grabbing the barrel of the gun and forcing it down. "Do not harm it. This is its apotheosis." Progenitus, hearing their voices, whirled around, its 3 heads fixed on the 2 men. A low, guttural growl, the last remnant of its griffin sire, rumbled in its chest. The 2 Hydra heads hissed, their forked tongues tasting the air, recognizing the scent of their tormentors. It was in that moment that the wall gave way. With a final, deafening screech of tearing metal, a huge section of the wall collapsed inward. A tidal wave of murky, foul-smelling water surged into the surgical car, carrying with it the furious, writhing form of the matron of Lerna. The original Hydra was a sight of primal terror. Far larger than her offspring, her central mass was the size of a small carriage, and her dozens of serpentine necks whipped through the air, her many heads shrieking in a chorus of long-suppressed rage. She was free. The water, now ankle-deep, swirled around Jayaman and Vane. The doctor stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. Vane, however, was laughing, a high, unhinged peal of laughter that was swallowed by the shrieks of his creations. The matron and Progenitus saw each other. There was a moment of stillness, a silent communion between mother and child. The matron's dozens of heads ceased their random thrashing and focused, their yellow eyes blinking in unison. Progenitus lowered its heads in a gesture that was almost one of deference. There was no touching, no nurturing. There was only a shared, silent acknowledgement of their mutual hatred for their captors. Then they attacked. They did not attack each other. They attacked the same target. Jayaman was the first to go. The matron struck like a living whip. A dozen heads shot forward, their jaws snapping shut on his limbs, his torso, his head. He didn't even have time to scream. He was simply lifted from his feet and torn apart, the tranquilizer gun clattering to the floor. The sound of his dismemberment was lost in the shrieking of the hydras and Vane's mad laughter. Cora was pressed flat against the wall by the airlock, the foul water swirling around her boots. The creatures paid her no mind. She was insignificant, part of the scenery. Her only instinct was to flee, but her body would not obey. Vane stood his ground, his arms spread wide as if to embrace the beautiful, bloody chaos he had orchestrated. "Yes," he screamed over the din. "Yes, this is art. This is creation." Progenitus, its own fury now unleashed, turned its attention to the ringmaster. Its main griffin head lunged, its split beak sinking into Vane's shoulder, tearing through flesh and bone. Vane cried out, a sound of surprise and pain, but he was still smiling. "Incredible," he gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. One of the matron's heads snaked around his leg, pulling him off balance. He fell into the churning, bloody water. The two hydras descended upon him, a writhing, feeding frenzy of snapping jaws and tearing flesh. His screams were finally, blessedly, cut short. The circus was in ruins. The Fenrir wolf was still rampaging through the grounds. The hydras, mother and child, were loose in the train. Cora finally found her legs. She stumbled backward through the airlock, sealing the door on the scene of gruesome carnage. She ran. She ran past the empty cages, past the bodies of the crew who were not fast enough, past the wreckage of the tents. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. She found herself at the cage of Puckett. The satyr was standing, his hands gripping the bars, his face grim. He had watched it all. "You did it, healer," he said, his voice heavy. He did not sound triumphant. "You broke the locks." "You lied to me," Cora choked out, her body trembling. "The Gorgon's blood." "I told you it was a mercy," Puckett replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I did not say for whom. They were in pain. Now they are free. The world will feel their pain now. That is the mercy, the sharing of the burden." From the direction of the train came a new sound. A loud, unified roar from two throats, a declaration of a new, monstrous dynasty, mother and child. They had finished their meal, and now they were hungry for the world. The train, a symbol of their prison, began to shudder as they started to tear it apart from the inside out, beginning their long, slow rampage into the unsuspecting night. Cora could only stand and watch the beginning of the horror she had helped perfect. Chapter 12. A New Dark World. The dawn broke on a scene of apocalyptic stillness. The sky, a bruised purple and orange, illuminated a world that had been unmade. The circus of myth was a graveyard. The wreckage of the tents lay like the carcasses of great, colorful beasts. The train cars were twisted and torn, ripped open from the inside as if by a giant can opener. The bodies of the crew were scattered where they fell, grim statues in the mud. The monsters were gone. Sometime during the night, after their initial furious rampage, they had vanished. The Fenrir wolf, its bloodlust sated, had likely melted into the deep woods that bordered the field. The hydras, mother and child, had left a wide, flattened trail of destruction leading toward a nearby river, the mud along its banks scorched and smoking from their acidic touch. They had returned to the water, to a new, larger domain. Of the other captives, a few remained. The lucky ones, the ones in the sturdiest cages like the basilisk and the troll, were still contained, stirring restlessly in their prisons. But most had either been killed in the crossfire or had taken the opportunity to escape. The circus, as a functioning entity, was dead. Cora had survived. She had hidden in the shell of the cookhouse, listening to the sounds of destruction finally fade into an exhausted silence. Now, in the cold light of morning, she walked through the ruins like a ghost. She was no longer a vet, no longer a healer. She was a survivor, a witness, a co-conspirator. She found Puckett still in his cage. The door had been torn from its hinges, but he had not left. He sat on his stool, cleaning his fiddle with a scrap of cloth, his expression one of profound melancholy. "They are gone," Cora stated, her voice hoarse. "For now," the satyr corrected, not looking up. "But a taste of freedom and revenge only whets the appetite. They will not be content with the wilderness for long. They will seek the places where the lights are bright and the herds are plentiful. The two-legged herds." "What have I done?" she whispered, the enormity of her actions settling upon her. She had not simply euthanized a creature. She had unleashed a plague upon the world. "You have restored a certain balance," Puckett said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were ancient and held no judgment. This world had grown soft, complacent. It had forgotten that there are things in the dark that have teeth. Vane collected them. You, healer, have simply reminded the world that they exist. He stood and tucked his fiddle under his arm. "I will go now. There are old paths I must walk." "Where will you go?" "To the places in between, to the deep woods and the high, lonely hills, to warn those who still listen. A storm is coming, born of your making. It is only right that a warning travels on the wind before it." He gave her a slight, formal bow. "Farewell, Cora Jenkins. You have made the world interesting again." With that, he walked away, his goat hooves making soft impressions in the mud, and disappeared into the morning mist. Cora was alone, truly alone. She wandered the wreckage, her mind a numb fog. She passed the alchemical wagon, its door hanging open, its pristine interior now ransacked and filthy. She saw the surgical car, a tomb of steel and water, and forced herself to look away. Her steps eventually led her to her own small quarters in one of the few undamaged cars. Her satchel was still slung over her shoulder. Inside, amidst the remnants of her former life, syringes, bandages, medical texts, was the lead-lined box. She opened it. The empty mortar and pestle were still inside, stained with the black dust of the Gorgon's blood. An idea began to form in her mind, a terrible, necessary idea. She was the only one left, the only one who knew the whole story. She knew Vane's methods, Jamin's science. She knew what the creatures were, what they had come from. She knew their strengths and their weaknesses. Vane had wanted to create a god. Puckett had wanted to unleash a monster, but she was a veterinarian. She knew that any animal, no matter how powerful or exotic, could be sickened, could be injured, could be put down. She was no longer Cora Jenkins, the compassionate healer. That person had died with Kaelan. She was something new now, forged in the fires of the circus's destruction. She began to gather supplies, her movements deliberate and focused. From the alchemical wagon, she salvaged Jayaman's notes, his chemical compounds, his strange and complex equipment. From the surgical car, she took what tools were not destroyed. From Flinch's personal effects, she took maps marked with poaching trails and animal migration routes. She was not a hero, she was not a savior. She was the woman who had opened Pandora's box. And now it was her responsibility, her penance, to hunt down every last horror that had flown out. Her war was just beginning. It would be a lonely, brutal, and thankless one. But it was hers, and she would see it through to the bitter, bloody end. Chapter 13. The Rust-Stained Town. The circus truck coughed and sputtered, its engine a testament to Jade Sparks' frantic patchwork repairs. Cora gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the cracked asphalt ribboning out before her. She had siphoned the fuel from the least damaged of the circus vehicles, a grim inheritance. Behind her, in the truck's covered bed, lay the curated tools of her new trade. Jayaman's leather-bound notebooks filled with spidery, coded script, a locked case of tranquilizer darts, vials of unidentified acids and reagents from the alchemical wagon, and a heavy, bolt-action rifle she'd taken from Boris the Bulgar's personal locker. It felt unnervingly solid against her shoulder. She drove for 2 days, fueled by stale crackers and a cold, simmering rage. The world outside her dusty windshield was unnervingly normal. Families in minivans, billboards advertising soft drinks, the mundane rhythm of a society completely unaware of the mythological horrors now bleeding into its margins. Each cheerful radio jingle was a discordant note in the funereal symphony playing in her mind. She was a ghost haunting a world that did not know it was already dead. Her first lead came over the crackling static of the AM radio. A small, gravelly-voiced announcer in a town called Havenwood Creek reported on a series of livestock attacks. The official line was a pack of unusually large coyotes or a bear displaced from the mountains. But the details made Cora's blood run cold. Fences 30 feet from the kills, torn from the ground. Carcasses not just eaten but pulverized, the bones shattered. And one eyewitness, a farmer dismissed as a drunk, who swore the thing that killed his sheep had eyes that glowed with a cold, dead light. Havenwood Creek was a town drowning in rust and resignation. The storefronts were faded, the paint peeling. The faces of the people she passed in the street were etched with a quiet, persistent weariness. It was a place at the edge of things, a town the world was forgetting, the perfect place for a monster to start its new life. She found the farm from the news report. The farmer, a man named Silas, had eyes that were haunted, not drunk. He took one look at the rifle in her truck and the grim set of her jaw and seemed to decide she was a different kind of official. He led her to the field without a word. The scene was one of controlled carnage. The dead sheep were gone, but the ground told the story. The grass was flattened in a wide circle, and the air still held a faint, sharp scent of ozone, an energetic residue that reminded her of the moments before a lightning strike. She knelt, her fingers tracing the edge of a paw print in the mud. It was immense, the size of a dinner plate. The claw marks sunk a good 6 inches into the earth. They said it was a bear, Silas said, his voice a dry rasp. He spat on the ground. I've seen bears. A bear runs, it climbs. It don't leap 60 feet from a dead standstill. It don't have eyes that make you feel the winter in your bones. Cora stood, scanning the tree line at the edge of the sprawling property. Fen. It had to be. The lingering scent of ozone was the ghost of the shattered runes, a magical static bleeding from the creature. Did it make any sound? She asked, her voice low. Not when it was killing, Silas said, a shudder running through him. The sheep made all the noise, but later, after it was done and heading back to the woods, it howled. Not like a wolf, deeper, like a church organ playing a song about the end of the world. That was all she needed. She thanked Silas, who simply nodded, his gaze distant. He had seen a myth, and it had broken something inside him. Cora drove the truck to the edge of the woods, concealing it in a thicket of overgrown pine trees. She spent the next hour preparing. She loaded the rifle, the heavy cartridges clicking into place with sounds of metallic finality. She strapped a belt around her waist, fitting it with a long hunting knife and several pre-filled syringes. These were not the sedatives she had used on Kaelan. These were cocktails of Jaemin's own design, stimulants and neurotoxins intended to control, to agitate, to incapacitate. She was turning her knowledge of healing into a weapon. She pulled out Jaemin's notebook, flipping to the section on the Fenrir wolf. The script was dense, a mix of German and complex alchemical symbols. But she had spent years watching the doctor, learning his shorthand, deciphering his meaning. Canis gigantus, F-class specimen, physiologically anomalous. Cellular structure exhibits crystalline properties under duress, providing extreme resilience to kinetic force. Runes of Somnus provide primary containment. Note: specimen exhibits extreme adverse reaction to intense, rapid thermal change. Introduction of pyrophoric agents suggested for termination protocols. A creature of cold must be unmade by fire. A creature of cold must be unmade by fire. Cora looked through the case of reagents she had salvaged. She found what she was looking for, a small, sealed vial containing a clear, viscous liquid. The label read in Jaemin's neat script, triethylaluminium, a pyrophoric agent. It ignited instantly and violently upon contact with air, a fire that could not be easily extinguished. She carefully loaded the chemical into the hollowed-out tips of 3 tranquilizer darts. This was her weapon, not the rifle, which would do little more than anger the beast, but 3 small darts filled with liquid fire. As dusk began to settle, painting the woods in long, deep shadows, Cora shouldered her rifle and slipped into the trees. The trail was easy to follow, a path of broken branches, splintered trees, and the occasional, unnervingly large paw print. She was no longer a veterinarian. She was a hunter, and she was stalking a god. The sun disappeared completely. The forest became a maze of black trunks and impenetrable shadow. The air grew cold. Then she heard it, a low, resonant howl that echoed through the trees, a sound of profound loneliness and limitless power. It was closer than she expected. The hunt had begun, but she was no longer certain who was the predator and who was the prey. Chapter 14. The Breath of Winter. The forest at night was a different world, a place of primal fears and indistinct shapes. Every rustle of leaves was a stalking footstep, every snap of a twig a prelude to an attack. Cora moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her senses on fire. The cold was a physical presence, sinking into her bones, a cold that felt unnatural, manufactured. It was the aura of the beast, the lingering breath of its broken enchantments. She followed the trail for what felt like hours, guided by the immense tracks and the path of destruction the wolf left in its wake. It was not moving like a normal animal. It was rampaging, asserting its dominance over this new territory. She found the carcass of a massive buck, its neck snapped, its body strangely untouched by scavengers. A thin layer of frost coated the dead animal's fur, despite the mildness of the autumn night. The wolf was toying with her. It would let her get close, the sound of its heavy paws crunching on the forest floor just ahead before it would melt away into the darkness, its low growl a mocking whisper on the wind. It knew she was there. It was leading her somewhere. Her pursuit led her to a region of the forest where the trees grew old and twisted, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for the moonless sky. She came to a place where the earth dropped away, the entrance to an old, abandoned iron mine. A crude, faded sign read, "Blackwood Ridge Mine, keep out." The air pouring from the mine's dark maw was frigid, carrying the scent of damp earth, wet fur, and a distinct, sharp tang of ozone. This was its lair. She took cover behind a rocky outcrop, her rifle resting on the stone. She did not charge in. Vane's arrogance had been his downfall. Jayaman's short-sightedness had led to his own dismemberment. She would not make their mistakes. She was a scientist, a Methodist. She pulled out the tranquilizer pistol, its grip cold and solid in her hand. It was loaded with the 3 pyrophoric darts. This was her only real weapon. She had to make the shots count. She reviewed Jayaman's notes again under the dim light of her shielded flashlight. Crystalline cellular structure. The creature's skin and muscle tissue could harden in response to impact, making it nearly bulletproof. The rifle was a distraction, a tool to draw its attention, to make it expose a weaker part of its body. The notes mentioned a spot just behind the shoulder blade where a major nerve cluster was less protected. A direct hit there with the pyrophoric agent would be catastrophic, introducing the chemical fire directly into its nervous system. A deep growl echoed from the mouth of the mine, and a shape emerged from the darkness. Fen was larger than she remembered, a creature of nightmare made real. He was the size of a small horse, a mountain of black fur and muscle. His fur seemed to suck the light from the air, and a shimmering aura of cold radiated from his body. His eyes were not just glowing. They were like 2 pools of liquid frost, burning with a cold, intelligent light. He was not just an animal. He was a piece of rogue magic, a shard of ancient winter given life and fury. He stood at the entrance to the cave, his massive head low, his lips peeled back from teeth like ivory daggers. He was not looking at her. He was looking past her as if scanning the forest for a greater threat. Then his gaze snapped to her hiding spot, and he locked eyes with her. He knew. Cora's breath hitched. This was the moment. She raised the rifle, her cheek pressed against the cool wood of the stock, the crosshairs settling on the wolf's massive chest. It was a useless target, but it was the only one she had. "You remember me, don't you?" she whispered into the cold air. "I was there. I watched them chain you. I watched you sleep." The wolf let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that vibrated in her chest. It took a step forward, then another, its movements a slow, deliberate promise of violence. Cora squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that shattered the night's silence. The bullet hit the wolf square in the chest and ricocheted off with a metallic whine, as if it had struck solid steel. The impact did nothing but enrage it. With a roar that was pure, elemental fury, Fenn charged. He did not run. He bounded, covering the 50 yards between them in a matter of seconds. The ground shook with his approach. Cora dropped the rifle and drew the tranquilizer pistol, her hand steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. She had one chance. She had to make him expose his flank. She stood her ground until the last possible second. The wolf was a black tsunami of fur and teeth, its hot breath a fog in the cold air. Just as it leaped, its claws extended to tear her apart, she threw herself to the side, rolling behind a thick oak tree. The wolf slammed into the tree with the force of a car crash. The ancient oak shuddered, splinters flying. Fenn whirled, faster than a creature that large should be able to move. He was on her again, but in his turn he had exposed his side. Cora fired. The pistol hissed and the first dart shot through the air, a silver streak in the darkness. It struck the wolf's flank just behind the shoulder blade. A perfect hit. The effect was instant and horrific. The pyrophoric agent ignited on contact with the air and the wolf's magical biology. A brilliant, silent flash of white-hot fire erupted from the impact point. Fenn screamed, a sound of agony that was 1,000 times worse than his roars of rage. He thrashed, trying to bite at the fire that was consuming him from the inside out. The fire did not spread over his fur. It burned inward, a contained chemical inferno. He turned on her, his eyes now blazing with not just rage, but pure, unadulterated hatred. He was wounded, dying, but he was still a god of destruction. He lunged again, ignoring the fire consuming his body. Cora fired the second dart. It hit him in the neck. Another silent, brilliant flash. The wolf stumbled, its powerful legs buckling. The cold aura around him flickered and died. He collapsed to the ground, his massive body convulsing. A strange, crystalline dust, like fine snow, began to flake away from his body, dissolving into the air. The magic was unraveling. He lay on his side, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. The 2 spots of fire still burned, but they were sinking deeper, cauterizing, destroying. The great beast was being unmade. His glowing eyes found hers one last time. There was no hatred in them now, only a vast, weary confusion. Then the light faded, leaving only dark, glassy orbs. Fenn was dead. Cora stood there, her entire body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. The air was no longer cold. The oppressive, unnatural winter had broken. She looked at the massive, still form of the wolf. There was no triumph in her heart, only a hollow, aching emptiness. One down. She walked over to the body, the tranquilizer pistol still held ready. The fires had burned themselves out, leaving two deep, charred wounds. The creature was just an animal now. An immense, impossible animal, but the magic, the thing that made it fen, was gone. She had done it. She had proven Jaehamon's theories correct. She had weaponized his science. A chilling thought entered her mind. How different was she, really, from her former masters? She had hunted, trapped, and destroyed. Pushing the thought away, she began the grim task of ensuring her victory. She had to be certain. She retrieved her knife, its edge gleaming in the faint starlight. As she knelt by the great wolf's head, her eyes caught something clutched in its jaws, something it had been carrying in the mine. It was a tattered, muddy piece of canvas. She pried the wolf's jaws open and pulled it free. It was a fragment from one of the circus banners, the one that had hung above the Hydra's wagon, but it was the back of the canvas that drew her attention. Scrawled in what looked like grease pencil was a series of numbers and letters, a coordinate, and below it a hastily drawn symbol. It was a crude depiction of a river flowing into a larger body of water, and at the convergence, a circle with a jagged line like a lightning bolt drawn through it. It was a map, Vane's map. Fen must have torn it from a wagon during the rampage. She pulled out the road atlas she had taken. With trembling fingers, she found the coordinate. It corresponded to a location 300 miles east, a massive, state-run reservoir and hydroelectric dam. The symbol on the banner fragment matched the symbol for a power plant on her map. The Hydras were not just hiding in a river, they were on a pilgrimage. They were heading to a place of immense, concentrated power, a place Vane had marked on his map, a place they could perhaps feed from or worse, corrupt. The hunt was not over. The true challenge had just revealed itself. Chapter 15. The Dead River. The journey east was a descent into a new kind of quiet. The grim satisfaction of defeating Fen had evaporated, replaced by the chilling weight of her discovery. Vane's plan had been grander and more terrifying than she had ever imagined. The circus was not just a traveling prison. It was a mobile army, moving along a strategic path, a pilgrimage route of power. He wasn't just creating a god, he was planning to enthrone it. Cora drove, the crumpled piece of canvas with its hand-drawn map sitting on the passenger seat next to her. The hydroelectric dam, a place of immense, controlled energy. What would a creature like the matron or her even more volatile offspring do with access to such a source? Could they absorb it, control it? The thought sent a tremor of fear through her. As she drew closer to the coordinates, the landscape began to change. The towns grew sparser, the forests thicker. She began to follow the path of the Calumet River, the waterway the Hydras had almost certainly used as their highway, and she began to notice the signs. At first they were subtle, a strange lack of birds in the sky, an absence of fishermen on the banks. Then the signs became more overt. She passed a herd of cattle, all standing in a field, facing away from the river, their bodies tense and still. She saw dead fish, belly up, floating in the eddies near the shore, their scales coated in a strange, slimy, greenish film. The river was dying. She pulled the truck over at a dilapidated boat launch and walked to the water's edge. The air was thick with the smell of decay and chemicals. The water itself was unnaturally still and had a murky, opalescent quality, the same sickly sheen she had seen in the matron's tank and in the fluid used to create progenitus. They were poisoning the water as they passed, their very biology a relentless, creeping contamination. Her mission had changed. This was no longer just a hunt. It was a quarantine, a decontamination. She arrived at the town just downstream from the dam late in the afternoon. It was called Port Cauldron, a name that now seemed horribly prophetic. The town was in a state of quiet panic. The local sheriff's office was besieged by concerned citizens. The water from the taps had started to run cloudy, and it tasted of metal and rot. People were getting sick. A strange, blistering rash had begun to appear on those who had come into contact with the river water. Cora bypassed the town, driving directly to the dam. It was a colossal monument of concrete and steel, a sheer, curving wall holding back a vast expanse of water. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Power lines as thick as her body snaked away from the generator houses, carrying electricity to half the state. She parked her truck in a wooded area overlooking the facility and began her reconnaissance. The dam was a fortress, surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. Security patrols were visible, their movements made more frequent and agitated by the developing crisis in the town below. She could not simply walk in. She spent the rest of the day observing, using a pair of powerful binoculars from her kit. She mapped the patrol routes, the security camera placements, the locations of the generator houses. Her gaze was repeatedly drawn to the spillway gates at the base of the dam and the massive intake turbines, churning just below the surface of the reservoir. That was where they would be, close to the power. As night fell, she prepared her equipment, her mind working with a cold, clinical focus. This was not a fight she could win with force. The hydras were too powerful, the environment too complex. This was a problem of biology and chemistry. She opened Jamin's notebooks, her flashlight beam dancing across the spidery script. She searched for anything on the matron's unique biology, her acidic properties, her regenerative capabilities. She found a series of notes on a failed experiment. Vane had wanted to find a way to nullify the Hydra's regeneration, to make it vulnerable. Jamin had theorized that a specific, complex saline solution, hyperoxygenated and introduced directly into the creature's environment, could trigger a cascading cellular collapse. The regeneration would not just stop, it would violently reverse, the creature's own biology turning on itself, consuming its flesh in a chain reaction of decay. The experiment was deemed too difficult to implement in the confines of the tank. But the dam was not a tank, it was a system. A plan began to form, audacious and terrifyingly dangerous. The dam's maintenance system used a series of powerful chemical pumps to treat the water, to prevent algae growth and corrosion. If she could access that system, she could use Jamin's notes to mix the compound he had designed. She could turn the entire reservoir into a weapon. She could poison the well. It would be a race against time. The compound, once introduced, would be devastating to the local ecosystem. It would be a permanent scar on the land. But the hydras were a cancer. Sometimes the only way to treat cancer is to burn the patient. It was a horrific choice, a choice between a dying river and a world terrorized by two immortal, power-engorged monsters. There was no choice at all. She found a schematic of the dam in a lockbox she had taken from Jade Sparks' abandoned workshop. She identified her target, a chemical treatment substation located near the base of the dam, a weak point in the facility's otherwise formidable security. Her bag was heavy with stolen chemicals, Jayaman's notes, and the weight of her decision. She looked out at the dam, its concrete face illuminated by stark floodlights, a monument to mankind's hubris. Vane had tried to build a god in a cage. Now she was preparing to poison an ocean to kill it. She pulled on a dark jumpsuit, smeared her face with mud for camouflage, and slipped into the night. Her objective was clear. She had to break into the heart of the dam and perform a monstrous act of alchemy. She was no longer just a hunter. She had become a saboteur, ready to inflict a wound on the world to save it from a far greater sickness. Chapter 16: The Poisoned Heart. The fence was the first obstacle. It was 12 feet high, a web of chain link topped with a cruel crown of barbed wire. The security patrols were regular, their flashlight beams cutting predictable arcs through the darkness. Cora lay flat in a drainage ditch, the damp earth cold against her body, and watched. She timed the patrols, counted the seconds. There was a 47-second window between the moment one guard passed and the next came into view. She had come prepared. Using a pair of heavy, rubber-handled bolt cutters from the truck, she waited for her moment. The patrol passed. She moved, a dark shape against the deeper shadows. The cutters bit into the thick wire of the fence with a series of sharp, muffled snaps. The sound was deafening in the silence. She worked with a desperate, focused speed, creating a gap just large enough to squeeze through. 40 seconds. She was through, the barbs on the wire snagging at her jumpsuit, tearing the fabric. She dropped to the ground on the other side, just as the next flashlight beam swept over the area where she had been. She was inside. The chemical treatment substation was a low, windowless concrete bunker set apart from the main structure of the dam. It was a place of utility, not high security. According to the schematics, it was a node, the place where chemicals were mixed before being injected into the massive intake pipes. It was the dam's heart, and she was here to give it a heart attack. The lock on the substation door was heavy and industrial, far beyond the capabilities of a simple lockpick. But Jayaman, in his paranoia, had equipped his alchemical wagon with a variety of interesting tools. Cora pulled a small, canister-like device from her pack. It was a chemical drill, a tool that used a highly corrosive, contained acid to eat through metal. She pressed it against the lock mechanism. It hissed, and a foul, acrid smoke filled the air. In less than a minute, the lock dissolved into a molten, bubbling slag. The door swung open into a dark, humming interior. The air inside was thick with the smell of chlorine and ozone. A series of massive tanks dominated the room, connected by a labyrinth of pipes and valves. A single control panel, its lights blinking in the darkness, governed the entire system. This was it. She worked by the dim red light of a headlamp, spreading Jaemin's notes across a catwalk. The formula for the saline solution was complex, a precise and volatile recipe. She began to gather the base components from the dam's own supply tanks: sodium chloride, potassium permanganate, concentrated hydrogen peroxide. She worked with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon, her past life as a vet and her grim education under Jaemin merging into a new, dangerous skill set. The final, key component was a catalyst she had brought with her, a small vial of powdered silver nitrate Jaemin had used in his alchemical experiments. She paused, the vial in her hand. This was the point of no return. The moment she added this, the reaction would begin. The poison would be made. A new sound reached her, cutting through the hum of the pumps. It was a deep, resonant thrumming that was not mechanical. It was coming from the direction of the dam itself, a vibration she could feel in the soles of her boots and the fillings in her teeth. They were close. They were drawing power, their bodies acting as living conductors, absorbing the raw energy leaking from the immense turbines. They were feeding. There was no more time. She poured the silver nitrate into the main mixing tank. The solution inside flashed with a brief, brilliant blue light and then began to churn, a low, ominous bubbling that grew in intensity. The poison was brewing. Now she had to inject it. She turned to the control panel, her fingers flying across the buttons, overriding the automated systems, forcing the pumps into a manual sequence. She had to divert the entire contents of the mixing tank into the main reservoir intake, bypassing the smaller treatment pipes. It was a crude, brute force approach that would undoubtedly trigger every alarm in the facility. As she worked, the thrumming from the dam grew louder, more insistent. It was joined by a new sound, a high-pitched, harmonic shriek that echoed through the concrete. It was progenitus, its voice a dissonant chorus of rage, no longer just feeding, but communicating with the energy source, its unique biology resonating with the electricity. The control panel flashed red. A klaxon began to blare throughout the facility, a loud, whooping cry of warning. She had been detected, but it was too late. With a final keystroke, she engaged the main pump. A deep, shuddering groan vibrated through the bunker as thousands of gallons of the hypersaline, oxygen-rich poison were forced from the tank and into the heart of the reservoir. Her job was done. She grabbed her pack and fled the bunker, melting back into the darkness as security vehicles, with flashing lights, began to converge on the substation. She did not head for the fence. She ran toward the dam wall itself. She had to see it. She had to know if it worked. She found a vantage point on a high ridge overlooking the reservoir, the vast, dark expanse of water before the dam. The water was no longer still. It was churning, as if boiling from below. In the center of the turmoil, two forms were visible, their bodies illuminated by the panicked floodlights of the dam. The matron and progenitus were thrashing in the water, their movements no longer powerful but spastic and uncontrolled. The poison was in their environment, in their gills, in their very cells. The reversed regeneration Jaemin had theorized was happening. It was not a peaceful end. It was an implosion. Their scales, once hard and iridescent, began to flake away, dissolving into the toxic water. Lesions appeared on their serpentine necks, not healing, but widening, deepening, flesh slewing off the bone in wet, steaming chunks. Progenitus's mismatched body seemed to be tearing itself apart, its avian and reptilian halves finally rejecting each other in a final, agonizing divorce. The matron let out a final, soul-shattering shriek, a sound of profound agony and disbelief as her own immortal flesh betrayed her. Her many heads turned on each other, snapping and tearing in a final, insane frenzy before they dissolved into nothing. Her massive body convulsed one last time and then sank beneath the churning, poisoned waves. Progenitus lasted a moment longer. It dragged its broken body onto the concrete lip of the intake valve, its three heads gasping. Its two hydra heads had already melted into shapeless, bubbling stumps. Only its main griffin head remained. It lifted its head, and in the harsh glare of the floodlights, its black, depthless eyes found Cora's vantage point on the ridge. It stared directly at her. In that final moment, she did not see a monster. She saw Kaelan. She saw the sad, defeated eyes of the father, a final, fleeting echo of the sky in a creature born of the abyss. There was no hatred in its gaze, only a vast, terrible question. Then, with a soft, final shudder, the last remnant of the hybrid dissolved, melting into a puddle of viscous, steaming fluid that dripped back into the water and was gone. The klaxons still blared, the lights of security vehicles still flashed, but the water was still. The monsters were dead. Cora Jenkins had won. Chapter 17. The Last Page. The sun rose on a wounded world. The water of the Port Cauldron Reservoir was a chemical soup, its surface littered with the bodies of fish and birds that had been caught in the crossfire of Cora's war. The ecosystem was devastated, a sacrifice laid upon the altar of human safety. The official story, quickly concocted and disseminated by men in dark suits who had arrived before dawn, was of a catastrophic chemical spill from an undocumented tanker, a tragic industrial accident. They were burying the truth under a mountain of lies, and Cora, the ghost in the machine, was happy to let them. She watched them from a distance, from the anonymity of a cheap motel room 100 miles away. Her face was a pale, drawn mask in the flickering light of the television screen. Her hands were clean, but she felt stained to her very soul. Her work was done. The Fenrir wolf was dust. The hydras were a memory dissolved in poison. The other escaped creatures were lesser threats, disorganized and scattered. They would be hunted by others now, by men like Silas who had seen the truth, or by the quiet, efficient men in suits who were now swarming the dam. Her part in the story was over. She unpacked her bag for the last time. The notebooks of Dr. Jayaman, the schematics of Jade Sparks, the half-empty vials of Vane's mad science. They were a testament to a world that should not have existed, a world she had helped to create and then, single-handedly, to destroy. She built a small, neat pyre in the rusted-out barbecue pit behind the motel. One by one, she fed the pages of Jayaman's research to the flames. She watched the complex formulas and horrific diagrams blacken, curl, and turn to ash. She was erasing the recipe. She was ensuring that no one, no matter how arrogant or ambitious, could ever follow in Vane's footsteps. This strain of madness would die with her. When the last page was ash, she was left with nothing but her memories and the hollowed-out feeling of a war won at an immeasurable cost. She was no longer a vet, a hunter, or a saboteur. She was just Cora Jenkins, a woman with too many ghosts. She got back in the truck. She had no destination, no plan. She simply drove. She drove west toward the setting sun, leaving the poisoned rivers and haunted forests behind her. She drove for days, letting the white lines of the highway lull her into a state of numb exhaustion. She was running, not from any monster of fur or scale, but from the memory of what she had done, of the choices she had made. One evening she pulled into a small roadside diner in the middle of a vast, empty desert. The air was clean and dry. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue, unmarred by clouds or the smoke of industry. She took a seat at the counter, the worn vinyl cool against her skin. The waitress who took her order was a young woman with kind eyes and an easy smile. The coffee was hot and strong. For the first time in a very long time, Cora felt a flicker of something other than fear or anger or guilt. It was a faint, fragile thing, like the first sprout after a wildfire. It might have been peace. As she sipped her coffee, a news report came on the small television mounted in the corner of the diner. It was a local story. A team of geologists surveying a remote, unexplored cave system in the nearby mountains had gone missing. Search parties had been dispatched but had found nothing. The anchorwoman spoke of treacherous terrain and the dangers of amateur spelunking. But then they showed a picture, a blurry photograph taken by one of the geologists before they disappeared. It was a picture of the cave wall, and on the wall, clearly visible in the camera's flash, was a carving. It was an ancient petroglyph, impossibly old. It depicted a circle with a jagged line like a lightning bolt drawn through it. The same symbol Vane had drawn on his map, the symbol for a place of power. Cora's blood ran cold. The cup trembled in her hand, rattling against the saucer. It wasn't over, it was never over. Vane's circus was just one stop on the map, a single chapter in a much older, much larger story. The map wasn't his, he had found it. He was a follower, not a pioneer. And there were other places, other dormant things waiting in the deep, dark places of the world. The waitress returned with a fresh pot of coffee. "Everything okay, hun?" she asked, noticing Cora's pale face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Cora looked up from the television, her eyes meeting the waitress's kind gaze. A slow, weary resolve settled over her. Her penance was not yet paid. Her war was not over. It had just changed locations. "No," Cora said, her voice steady and clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Not a ghost." She pushed a few bills onto the counter, enough to cover the coffee and a generous tip. She stood up, her back straight, her purpose renewed. The hollow feeling was gone, replaced by the cold, familiar weight of responsibility. A job opening. The end.